Okay. Hello, everyone. It's not too many yet, I think, because I've been incapable of starting the live stream before for some reason. So it might just be 2 or 3 people. But that's okay. I hope you've all gotten yourself a drink. It's 6 p.m. after all, at least where I am. So get yourself a glass of wine or gin and tonic, maybe a whiskey. No beer is allowed for now. And we'll talk leisurely about leisure, about idleness, otium cum dignitate. This won't be too academic tonight, probably. I have a bit of I've got some notes. And what I'll talk about is the principle otium cum dignitate, which comes from Cicero, which I like to translate as idleness with dignity, for reasons that I'll maybe get into. But I'd also like to introduce with this my online course on idleness with dignity, how to be idle with dignity. A subtitle could be noon here, Drelock. Well, still, you can start drinking now. It's Saturday, after all, we're all locked in. I'm in my pod, so the machine has got us right where it wants us. Still, how can we break the machine? Well, by reconfiguring our senses. And our Menschensinn, so this is a word that we no longer use in German. Menschensinn is a word that Goethe still knows. Menschensinn, hi Max. Menschensinn means the sense of what it means to be human. And the sense, in an idealized version of the past, of the Menschensinn was directed at leisure, weirdly enough, at Skole. I'll get into this in a bit. But so Skole, there's a reason why Josef Pieper was a Catholic, German Catholic author and philosopher in the 20th century, said that leisure is the basis of civilization. And that's, Musse is the German word for this. And that's weird because what we think of as leisure is it's some time free from work that we then can use for some sort of self-optimization or self-cultivation for hobbies, etc. And to some degree, maybe that also lies in the word itself. The word leisure comes from French plaisir, and that comes from the Latin licere, and that's where you get the English word license from. So leisure in English is related to the word license. So you get the license to be at leisure sometimes when you're off the hook from making a dime to make ends meet. But here's something that the Greeks understood, the Athenians understood, that perhaps we have forgotten, which is that what they called skole is the basis of everything. And that's something I want to get across in the course. So the course has got, and there might be a few people watching who were in the Heidegger course with Justin Murphy, Heidegger Deleuze. We had 3 seminars. With this course, there'll be 7. So we will have 7 weeks in a row, so 7 consecutive Saturdays of live seminars, of group seminars, and each will be on one of the lectures, one of the videos or audio files, and short essays. The lectures are slightly shorter, but still, I think there's lots in there. So there's one on Plato and Aristotle, one on Cicero, one on Wilhelm von Humboldt on the university ideal. There's one on Nietzsche, one on Bertrand Russell, one on Martin Heidegger, and the last one on Josef Pieper, which I just mentioned before. And what I'd like to get across there, what I want to get across is that we use this time, not just to self-cultivate, etc., for the idolatry of the self, but no, we use this time to reorient our senses to found again what I like to call the coming Renaissance, the coming Renaissance, where we get back to a sense of true leisure, skole, as the basis, the foundation for who we are. So 7 group seminars in total. There's a link to the course just down below. There should also be a code if you open the entire box there is a use idler 50, you get 50% off. There's a limited amount of that. It should be around 20 or so. And so the course will begin on Plato and Aristotle. And here's what Plato tells us, and this is very significant. Plato talks in a dialogue which is Critias, the Critias dialogue, Critias, about Atlantis, about how and why Atlantis sank. And Atlantis sank. Why? Why? Because they became a bit arrogant. What Plato tells us, just en passant, he mentions this almost just, he doesn't make it a focus, it seems, but I think it's rather crucial. Atlantis sinks because they directed their sense, their nous, their mentioned sin, towards lack. They focused on what was lacking. Their harbor, Plato tells us, never stood still. The harbor was always running. It was always full on. There was never a moment's peace, never quiet, never calm, never any rest that was allowed. The harbor always ran. And that's perhaps how they lost their senses. It was, what's the word for this now today? Just-in-time delivery, right? Just-in-time delivery, which depletes the earth and destroys the human being. And Atlantis is sinking again, as I've said, a bit exaggeratingly in some other video. But then Plato tells us how Athens became Athens, right? How Athens became this garden of meaning, this abundance of meaning and truth, which the fruits of which we still enjoy today. In Athens at first, before it became properly Athens, the Athenians, or the people of this future city-state, they were not really interested in mythologia, as Plato says in the original Greek. So they did not concern themselves with legends, with tradition, with the old, with their ancestry, because they had their sense, their nous directed at what was lacking. And then it's a question of how you translate this passage. One can translate this passage as saying, once they had secured all of their basic needs, that's when they started to use their time for leisure. So once we have enough, then we can spend some time on leisure. And that's how we usually think of it. Once we've secured everything, then we can finally enjoy some leisure. Now, there's another way of translating this passage, which is once their sense, their nous was directed at skole, where you get the English word school from, by the way. Once it was directed at skole, so the stance in life was fullness, richness, full flowingness. That's when the world lights up in a different way, and skole is then the basis of the polis that was then called Athens. And as my friend Sean Burke, who's also a fellow of the My Halcyon Guild, and whose book will publish very soon, which is Winter and Summer, a great extended memory of what it means to be human, because he fears that with transhumanism and technology, etc., we're working towards retiring the human being. We're tired of being human. And that maybe also has to do with a very unleisurely, a very non-leisurely, anti-leisure, anti-skole way of being. My teacher, Ivo De Gennaro, who's a professor in Italy, there's a couple of conversations with him on the channel. He says that skole comes from, or is related to the verb echein in Greek, which means to have, to hold. So skole can also be translated as finding a hold, finding a place in existence, finding a stance in the midst of beings. And this is what happens with the Athenians. This is how they become Athens, because they simply redirect their sense to the fullness of being rather than towards lack. And it's obvious that we live in a period of extreme lack where nothing is ever enough, and that has to do with the operations of the will to will, right? The will to will that wills itself. Why? Because it wills itself. It wills more. It has to will more because it causes itself and needs to. Will more actually needs to have more and more appetite in order to justify to itself its own existence. Now, the other part of that first lecture is on Aristotle. And with Aristotle, very often quoted on leisure. So his metaphysics, what we now call metaphysics, his book Metaphysics, which he didn't call metaphysics himself, which was just placed metaphysica after the physics. So that book begins within the first couple of paragraphs. He says that we need to have secured everything, and then we can have leisure. So with Aristotle, you get to already a different understanding of leisure, and that's something that you can trace back all the way up until Marx. So I talk a bit about Marx actually also in the Plato Aristotle lecture, that the assumption that we must first secure everything in order then to find skole, a way to be in leisure, or to be idle, properly understood. That's something that only comes about with securing. So one of the thinkers I also talk about, who's talked about, In Praise of Idleness is one of his essays, Bertrand Russell. The essay isn't that, shall we say, isn't that super interesting, perhaps. But it speaks to something that's extremely modern. He says, first we need to have secured everything. Everything will be automated. And once we have full automation, then we can enjoy, again, festivities and ceremonies. And that sounds, this is from the 1920s, that of course sounds very much like what people now call full-on luxury communism or something like that. Or the UBI discourse is about the same thing, right? First, we have to have full automation, and then we can be at leisure again. And of course, what's happening now is when people have downtime and are home, some fall into a bit of a black hole, others don't. But still, it's the assumption is that we must first secure and then get the license to have some free time. And that's something that you can trace back all the way to Aristotle, and I'm tracing this all throughout the course. But in order to, I think the idea is that by going through the course, and best case scenario is you also join the 7 seminars, is that, which is almost like an entire semester, right? If you consider the UK, a semester usually has 10 weeks. One of them is a reading week. So you have 9 weeks of lectures. So we'll have 7 weeks of seminars. And by discussing the notion that one should begin from fullness, I hope that the outcome is that there's a redirection of our senses, a redirection of dimensions and of the sense of what it means to be human, so that we find, again, a different stance in this epoch, in the midst of beings, to speak with Heidegger. And now what I would like to point out maybe as well is that what you may have seen in the news, depending on where you're tuning in from, I think in the US, some universities who are extremely rich have already fired some of their staff, and they've sent all of their students home. Most of them they had to, of course. But some of the smaller colleges might suffer from this also tremendously. In the UK, what has happened just a couple of days ago is that some of the bigger universities fired some of the most vulnerable staff. So they fired people who are on so TAs like myself, or they fired support staff, or they fired people who are on some kind of temp contract, so a research fellow who's there for 2 years, or someone filling in for a full professor, or fired. Just, without furlough, nothing granted, just gotten rid of, which is perhaps done very quickly, right? Very abruptly. Instead of trying to help and find ways. Also, they could just be offering much more online now and use this time to reconfigure what they're actually offering. Because one of the things that's quite striking, of course, is that the humanities have stopped teaching the meaning of life, right? What do you learn in a philosophy degree? That you have 2 different hands? What it's like to be a bat? Or you read PowerPoint? They made us do PowerPoint last year, and I said to my students, look, if I make PowerPoint presentations, there's no need for you to come here and pay £9,000. Stay home, read Wikipedia. It's much more efficient. You will never learn how to think like that. And this is something what I'm trying to build towards and use this time for, and perhaps also the situation we're in. Okay, I don't know what that means, but still, yeah. I think that what I'm building towards is, with the Halcyon Guild, is a new way, a new academy, where the old ways of the humanities, what philosophy teaches, what old psychology teaches, will be taught again. These courses are the first part of this. So there is this course on how to be idle with dignity. There will be a course on Heidegger, on death and being, on the question of being as well, which should be out probably in May and June, together with with my book on Heidegger on death, which will be published by Springer. And so I'm trying to build a guild, which then hopefully will become its own full-on proper academy at some point, where simply what we're focusing on is not secondary literature, etc. No, but we're focusing on the original texts and trying to understand the trajectories that they open up in history. Now, it's very striking to me that Francis Bacon, who is one of the godfathers of modernity, speaks in one of his more esoteric essays not of a new Athens, but of a new Atlantis. So one of the godfathers of modernity speaks of a new Atlantis, where he talks about what we could call airplanes, and what we could call, for example, what we could call skyscrapers, genetically modified food. So it's a very strange place that he's describing there. But he's also not turning to Athens, right? He's turning to Atlantis, to an island that, according to the myth, sank. Why? Because they became arrogant, full of hubris, and focused their senses towards lack. So in the cradle of modernity, there's the assumption that we must become a new Atlantis, ultimately a sinking island. And rather than becoming a new Athens. So perhaps it's time to be as confident as Francis Bacon and rather call for a new Athens rather than a new Atlantis. Now, finding a hold in the midst of being is something that can only occur through proper thinking. This is not something that comes about with frantic action, but by a proper way of meditating, a proper way of being with beings and caring for beings and caring for others, which is what meditare, to meditate, where you get the word medicine from, ultimately means. And moving on to, so we have Plato and Aristotle at the beginning, and then we have Cicero. We'll talk about Cicero's principle, otium cum dignitate. Otium cum dignitate means idleness with dignity. So I like to think of otium as idleness. Why? Rather than leisure. Not because of Russell. So I'm not following Russell, but if anything, I follow Tom Hodgkins. And as you know, English is not my first language. So there's always a bit of something lost in translation, perhaps. But leisure has this sense of the leisure class, but it also has this sense of time spent for leisurely activities, time free from work. So it already has this bit of a negative connotation to time free from work. And idleness, of course, I know can mean laziness, and it can mean something like being, lost and being lazy, and is related to acedia, which is one of the 7 deadly sins. But still, the word idler, as you might know, Samuel Johnson, Doc Johnson, wrote an essay which is called The Idler, and he was an idler. He didn't like getting out of bed. But still, he wrote one of the greatest dictionaries of the English language, and he wanted to be an idler, which meant for him to be in the sense of free spirit, because there is a deep connection between being free from the constraints that others might want to give you and being an idler, being free, becoming free, being suspended from certain pressures, and finding a different stance in life, the stance of a free spirit. So that's perhaps something we can learn when we read these great thinkers and their stances on it. Now, what you see, for example, also with the Romans, their word for schola is otium, and the negation of this is negotium. So business, public life, politics to some degree, that would all mean negotium, the negation of otium. Otium itself was a positive notion. Otium itself is something that you can get into. So what Cicero does is actually crucial. This is something I get into more in the course. But what I find striking about Cicero is that he has the audacity to doubt the entire Roman, public life. You could only earn dignity. You could earn it only in public life, in negotium. And he says, no, there must be otium cum dignitate. So you could translate this as saying you have earned dignitas and then you withdraw into otium. But I think there's also a sense in Cicero where he says that you can earn dignitas in otium by focusing on philosophy, by, in this sense, cultivating poetry and philosophy for oneself, but also, of course, this has an impact on public life if the elite of a state are actually engaging in writing poetry rather than whatever they're engaging in these days, right? Reality TV or something like that. So Cicero invents this principle, this synthesis of otium cum dignitate. So it's not about, so I'm not trying to say that we should all sit down and read philosophy and then the world will be perfect. I don't think that that's the case. But there's something you can learn from Cicero, which is the state itself must be in a good order. And the elites must work towards for there to be a good order so that one can earn dignitas in negotium, but also in otium. And that's, I think, a helpful and important reminder. And the principle of otium cum dignitate comes back again. Nietzsche mentions it, so does Wilhelm von Humboldt. So moving on to Wilhelm von Humboldt, he came up with what we now call, or not him alone, but he kind of synthesized from others like Schleiermacher and others, what the proper university should be. And it's very much had a great influence over the past 230 years or so. Of course, it's coming to an end, this idea of the university as a place for otium cum dignitate, where he says something rather crucial, and I'm paraphrasing now, where he says that this is a quote, and he was a bureaucrat, taking seminars is a minor matter. What's important is healthy loneliness, and that healthy loneliness is paired then with withdrawing into a space that's entirely free from any bureaucratic pressures. Any. So there are no, to have a credit system would be very foreign to Humboldt. Taking seminars is not even that important. What's important is that people come together and learn together, so that in a self-actus, there's still the belief in a proper sovereign self, where one could, hey Gerardo, where one could become a proper individual. Because for someone like Humboldt, this is only 200 years ago, this still means that we become one with the cosmos, right? So enacting Bildung, self-formation, is not just to get a degree so that then we can go off and get a job, etc. No, it's about fulfilling the law of the cosmos within ourselves. Because he sees something in the modern state, which is that the modern state, on some level, there's all of a sudden, after the Enlightenment, there's this sensation of great negative freedom. But there's also the threat of the state becoming a bureaucratic, technocratic machine, a leviathan, right? And which does what to the human being? It turns the human being, and this is a quote from Humboldt, turns the human being into a machine. So the university must entirely stay free from any of these bureaucratic, technocratic pressures, so that the human being can spend this time, these years, in healthy loneliness, in a self-act, fulfilling the law of the cosmos, becoming truly oneself. And that would then be a remedy for the other threat of modernity, which is that we would all become technocrats and bureaucrats. If the university would be allowed to be this place, then the overarching bureaucratic apparatus could not take over, because we are reminded of our being human. So this is his reformulation of the Otium Cum Dignitate. That'll be one of the seminars where we focus on this. And for anyone who's just tuned in now, there's a link down below to a website called Teachable, and there should also be a promotion code. So you can type that in. I think it's idler50. You get 50% off tier 1 and tier 2. Tier 2 is the tier where you get the entire course content plus PDFs, etc., but also the 7 weeks of seminars, of group seminars. And just from my experience with Justin on the Heidegger and Deleuze course, it was a really wonderful experience, because we had about 20 students in the seminars. We talked about for 2 hours every single time, and they formed a breakaway group where they're now meeting and continue the discussion on Heidegger and a bit on Deleuze as well. And the seminars will be structured as follows. We'll have the set content, the set course for that day. So it'll be Plato in the first week. Second week will be Cicero. And you'll all have a couple of questions you can respond to, don't have to. You'll bring your own thoughts to it. We'll do Zoom split groups. So if there's 15 of us, say, we'll do 5 groups of 3 each. So you can get to know each other and then talk through a couple of questions and then bring it all back to the bigger group and bigger audience. And it's entirely free from instrumental rationality. There's no credit points. There's nothing you can get. There's no degree you can get. The only thing you can get is perhaps a bit of a reorientation of the sense of what it means to be human, to redirect it towards a new Athens. So I'm going to be as bold as Francis Bacon now and just say we need a new Athens, and we want this dying Atlantis to sink. And we want Gestell and framing to end. We wish for a human world. So let me a bit full of pathos perhaps today, right? But so after Humboldt, we'll move on to Nietzsche. In Nietzsche. What does he say in Twilight of the Idols? He says, the most obscene question today is, to a 23-year-old man, what career will you choose? And he says, as if one already had to be finished, finalized, a ready-made product. We are, he says, at the age of 30, still a child in high culture. And it's something I read recently in Goethe. In Goethe's Maximes, I think in English it would be Maximes and Reflections, Maxime und Reflexionen, where he says there's something unholy about our epoch. And that which is unholy is what? That nothing is allowed to ripen. Nothing is allowed to come into its own. By the way, that's the word in German for authentic, right? Everything today is authentic. There's authentic food, and maybe there's also inauthentic food, I don't know. But the word for German is eigentlich, coming into one's own. But one can only come into one's own if one takes the time to come into one's own. And he says also that we live in an age, this is 200 years ago, we live in an age where we create more debt to pay off debt, where there's a rustle and hustle of paper, money. And so Goethe was quite aware, I think, of what was going on, and so was Nietzsche. So Nietzsche speaks of what we'll consider also is the unpublished, and I think it's still not published. I think the notebooks are still not published. They're being translated, but I think it's going to take a lot more time to get them all published. So I'm considering some of the published works of Nietzsche on idleness and leisure, in The Gay Science, for example, and in Twilight of the Idols, but also some of the stuff that he's writing, that he's writing for himself most of the time in his unpublished notebooks or posthumously published notebooks. And one of these passages there, he talks about the uncanny wheelwork, which will inevitably come, which will inevitably be the history of the next 200 years. And he says there also, there will be a total economic management of the earth. And that'll be the history of the next 200 years. So if he's right, then we're right in the middle of it. And so we're looking at what Nietzsche has to say and what his remedy is to the moment where there is no longer leisure at the basis of civilization. And then we move on to Bertrand Russell. Now, Russell writes this essay, which is In Praise of Idleness. And it's a neat essay where he says nothing new, but there's something rather striking about it. So he says, once we have full automation, then we can finally enjoy some idleness. We can finally go. So he criticizes mass entertainment, and he wants people to go back to peasant ceremonies. But there's something he misses, which is the divine. Russell, of course, never talks about divinities or gods or anything divine. So he doesn't get to the point why it's all mass entertainment or idolatry in modern society. That's because there is no appreciation, no worship of the divine in leisurely activities. Hence the self-idolatry of man. And then that's something that's also a bit more sinister even with Russell, and I look forward to discussing that with you, which is, it seems that he's arguing for total automation, and only then can there be freedom again. And that's something sinister about this, and also what John Maynard Keynes talks about this as well. Keynes says in the 20s that we need 100 years of usury, 100 years of greed, so that by 2020, we will all be able to live off that substance that we've built over those 100 years. So the Cambridge boys were quite taken by this idea, it seems. And to some degree, there's a trajectory of Aristotle that shows itself here, and which is also Marx talks about this basically as well. But then there's also the problem of surveillance and what happens in a fully technicized society. Why would we only be free to enjoy again what it means to be human when everything is performed by machines? So that might lead to some interesting discussions, because some people might lean more in favor of something like this, and others might actually think that this is a terrifying outlook. And then you move on to Martin Heidegger and his notion of Gelassenheit, release. And I have to drink some wine. I hope you're all having a drink now too. Heidegger's notion of Gelassenheit is very difficult to translate. I think it's usually translated as releasement. But releasement is, I think it's an artificial word, so it doesn't exist really in English, and that's always difficult to get this across. So what is Gelassenheit? It means to allowing to let go, allowing for something to occur. And that has to do with this sense of idleness that I'm talking about, right? So Heidegger sees that there are these tremendous troubles with technology. And he never uses the word, but also with, of course, capitalism. And then as a response to this, he says we cannot will for some other world to come, because that would just be reinforcing the will. But rather we have to allow for this history, this trajectory to occur and run its course. But at the same time, we respond to it by saying politely no. And that lets appear another way of being, which is grounded again in skole, which is grounded again in proper leisure. So the Heidegger lecture will be on technology, but also on Lao Tse. So it'll be a bit on the Far Eastern Chinese philosophy that Heidegger often incorporates in his philosophy, in his way of thinking. And it will be on language as well, and the importance of heeding language, our language which originates in poetry. And then the last lecture will be on Pieper, on Josef Pieper. And to anyone who's just joined in, there's a link down below to the course content. You can scroll through that, what will be in what week. And there should also be a coupon where you get 50% off on the course for the next couple of hours. And so I hope that many of you who are there, I see that Charada, who's one of my students from Birkbeck, is there. Maybe you can enroll. That would be nice to see you again there. And I would, before I come to Pieper properly, it seems to be that there are these trajectories where everyone, even Russell, who was just a technicist, argues for some weird techno version of idleness, leisure, etc. But there seems to be a trajectory that different trajectories that open up at some point, where one of them states we need to begin from skole, we need to begin from leisure, and the other one leans towards saying no, we need to arrive at leisure. So we first need to secure. And I would argue that this latter trajectory, that's when all hell breaks loose, because this is where you have to continuously produce more, will more, do more, secure more, because our sense then is directed towards that which is lacking. And Pieper is an interesting figure, because Pieper reminds us of, by the way, if you have any questions, type them in now and I'll try and answer to them when I'm done. Pieper is a Catholic writer, and he writes his essay in the late 1940s. And he says that what we need is Musse, we need leisure again, and we need worship of God as a reminder, rather than the strongest will to build and rebuild the country, which was destroyed in the war. But he says, and I think what's weird about Pieper is that he warns of the world of total work. So what he saw, just like Jünger, but Jünger seemed to affirm it, what he saw was that what we're erecting is a world of total work, totale Arbeitswelt. And that means that everyone becomes a worker. So the priest class, even philosophers, everyone is a worker. Ein Geistesarbeiter, a worker, an intellectual worker, for example, for philosophers. And he sees the trouble. For him, the trouble begins with Kant, because Kant understands philosophy as purely discursive. So philosophy means to discuss and going back and forth in the argument, but not really to meditate. And this is why he comes back to Heraclitus very often, who says that those who sleep participate in the business of the world just as those who are awake. That's a very foreign thought to us, I guess, today. And Pieper is, I think, fascinating because he's a reminder of what could have been, but I think he ultimately fails to tell us exactly how, in what sense, leisure is the basis of civilization, because he doesn't, strangely enough, he does not point to the Critias dialogue by Plato. He does not point out that it's about directing our nous towards skole, our sense towards true leisure, the true spirit of leisure, in order to build again a proper Athens. Now, as I said before, if you have any questions, just type them in now, and I'll try. If I can answer them, I will. That's also something maybe that's a bit difficult to understand sometimes. Sometimes one just cannot answer all questions. There's something else maybe I could mention. Here's another video I made, which is there's a beautiful prescient short story by E.M. Foster, which is called The Machine Stops. So The Machine Stops tells of a story where people sit underneath the earth. They live underneath the ground. And they also they are connected to one another through what we would now call the internet. And all they do is they give lectures all the time, as I do now, a live lecture. But it's never a lecture that goes to so nothing goes to the origin. It's always just secondary, tertiary literature, what someone has said about what someone has said about what someone has said. And it never gets back to anything that's genuinely important, right? So this is something that people have bemoaned, is that the humanities have stopped teaching, or the universities have stopped teaching the meaning of life, which is what the universities should be. Universities should be a place where we understand what the meaning of life is, or at least begin to question this, rather than getting a degree in order to get, you see how the circle works, in order to get a career, in order to get into debt, in order to etc. What kind of clearing will social distancing reveal? Well, I think it's good that it's already moved away, I think, from social distancing to physical distancing. And it's always, one has to say, it's always different depending where you are. Something that's happening, I'm in London, and the British are, thank you, Stephen. The British are, so Stephen just said he liked the sound of the course and he's checking the site now. So yeah, there should be a link down there. Please let me know if something's not working. I'll type it in here. So I think it's different where you are. And in the UK, the Brits they're very freedom loving, right? I've heard people say, if the police come and stop me, I can tell them to bugger off. In Germany, it's already a bit different. What it's revealing is that the Germans like to be locked in, apparently. So people have to pay fines for sitting on a parking bench. But I think on a more fundamental level, what I see, this is purely anecdotal, right? So I'm trying to bring this to this level. I think what's happening is that the petty problems that we've had, they seem to be disappearing. They become slightly less important. And because to some degree, what Heidegger calls Gestell and framing is fracturing. It's showing itself not to be as wonderfully powerful or super powerful as it wanted to be. And that then throws us back into our mortality and also asks us to do what? To find again a stance, a way of holding ourselves in the midst of beings where we no longer are the willful functionary of cybernetics, for example. So this one of the questions by Gerardo is, what is true leisure? Does leisure automatically lead you to production in the artistic or philosophical sense, or is some kind of guidance or character provided? What I would say to this is, we don't need automation, but because the beginning of mankind is art. The origin of language is poetry. The beginning of what it means to be human is itself in art. We don't need first to have everything and then we can get to art. No, human beings are artists. Our language is not communication. Our language is poetry in the beginning. And this is something that Gestell wants us to forget, right? What I'm trying to do with this course is to maybe remind us of this old wisdom, if you like, of what it means to be human. Purely and simply, the question of idleness with dignity, skole, true leisure, is the question of what it means to be human. And so we don't need first to have everything in place, and then we can do some art, perhaps, if we're allowed to buy the machine. No, this is exactly what The Machine Stops, this short story by Foster, tells us, right? What he tells us is they're sitting underneath the earth, totally disconnected from everyone, with physical distancing or social distancing. And all they talk about is ideas that affect them for a couple of seconds, and then they move on to new ideas, but they're never touched by it in the sense that they would come back to their senses and want to be human again. It's the exact opposite of what's happening. So they live in perfect automation, but they live the least leisurely life of all, because leisure doesn't mean that you have all needs met. No, leisure means that you have found a stance in the midst of beings where you accept, for example, mortal finitude and are connected to origin. Okay, that's, someone says, which, by the way, I think I can, so Sacred Geometry Music is also a student of Ivo de Gennaro, says, I think leisure is like playing. When kids play, they do what they love and are active while they are relaxing. There's a sense of playing, yes. There's a sense in idleness of playing. And as you know, Heraclitus speaks of God being a child and playing. So I'm not sure what a Socratic skeptic who comments very often, you say, I guess there's a big difference between working hard and meditating a lot and what you are suggesting. So I'm not sure what the question is trying to get at, really. Maybe you could reformulate it and make it a bit clearer. Because what I'm trying to say is that it's not about doing nothing, or it's not about just doing something that's purely just for fun, right? Because this is how we think of leisure. Leisure is for fun, and then we have work over here. No, this dichotomy is the problem. If we were back to a leisurely sense, so for example, think of this as a teacher. This is not exhausting, right? Teaching sometimes is described by teachers at schools, high schools, but also in universities as exhausting and a burden, and I don't want to teach, and there's so much teaching load. Why would teaching for a scholar, for a researcher, be a load, a burden? No, to me that makes no sense, because the reading and then the writing and then the teaching, they're of one. They're of one, or they're of one kind. They're of one source, if you like. Because while I teach, I have to respond to questions, and it's unfortunate. I actually don't like this kind of questioning because I don't see you. This is why I like these Zoom group seminars much better, because the questioning is much more direct and I kind of sense where something's going. And so while I'm responding to your questions, I'm moving back, and I can't answer all of them, but then I will have to go back and read again and write again. Writing is an act of thinking, and then come back again and be more in dialogue with you as students, and of course as the teacher. The teacher is always the one who learns, who is a learner. So there is no burden in this, right? But as skole is lacking, and as everything is just directed at lack, for example, universities look towards, we need to get more students. We need to have more students because we have so many costs. We need to pay all our staff. So we need to recruit more students. That's already a lack. So students are already, as I've been told by professors at some universities that I've been at, make the customer happy. Students are now customers who have a right to being served as customers. So of course teaching becomes a burden. Of course there's no longer this deep relatedness between the reading, the writing, and the teaching. I can't speak about meditation in this Buddhistic sense. Matthias, my friend, just pointing out about Buddhism. So if you're interested, just read this, what he's got to say. He's very well known. He's very well, deeply steeped in Buddhism, and knows a lot about this. But in terms of an Occidental stance of meditation, you can think of Perianda. So Perianda says Melita Tanpan, which means care for all beings in their wholeness. And this is what Pieper is good at. Josef Pieper, the last lecture of the lecture series. He says, it used to be that we had an entire caste, if you like, who were just meditators in a Western sense. Monks, for example, who would simply sit and meditate being. And to us, and this is why he brings back Heraclitus and tells us, those who sleep, they participate in the business of the world. They participate in the world, even though they sleep. And for us, it's the doers, those who do and achieve. They're the ones who make the world and who change the world, etc. But without this sense of meditation and considering, caring for beings in the whole, and then recognizing them in a whole and as a belonging together, right? There is only this scatteredness that we have, and this nervousness. There is a certain nervousness about this new Atlantis that's now sinking. And the nervousness is covered over by ever louder screams of how everything's even newer than it was 2 seconds ago, and even better than it was 3 nanoseconds before. And we can now measure the smallest nanoseconds down to the very, very smallest particles. And then we finally reach this point where everything's a wonderful utopia, which never comes, by the way. And so we've lost our sense. We've simply lost our sense of what it means to be human. And this nervousness is now kicking in for those who've never asked this question. And of course, the entire system is getting nervous and trying to become more anti-fragile, etc. So to those who are new, there's a link down there to the course. So check the course contents. There'll be 7 lectures. For all of you who sign up for the group seminar, we'll be meeting literally for 7 weeks in a row. It would be nice if you could make all of those, but you don't have to, obviously. And I can't make you, so we'll meet over Zoom. If you use the code IDLER50, you get 50% off. And yeah, so we'll be talking about leisure for 7 weeks and get our mention sense right again, our human sense, back to normal, and back to a new normal, back to a new Athens, I shall say, and find again in skole a stance to take where with this stance, which is the classical sense, by the way. Why is this channel called Classical Philosophy? It's got nothing to do with some period of history. That's nonsense. No, to be classical, or aspiring to be classical, means to begin from this full flowingness, a full flowing yes to life. As Nietzsche says, amor fati. Right? This is what being classical means. You can allow for, in the großer Stil, the grand style, you can allow for the Dionysian and the Apollinian of life, and the stance you take is not the stance of the romantics who think that there's lack in the world fundamentally, but no, it's full flowingness, and in that sense, a longing for being. So that's the course content of these 7 lectures and then the 7 group seminars, where I will be facilitating the discussions, but also will be facilitating the possibility for you to have, after that, some sort of a forum. Because usually what happens with these online groups is that people make friends and start emailing, especially over the course of 7 weeks. That's like going to school with someone. So I will be happy to facilitate that too, so that you can stay in touch and become more leisurely in this period that we've actually, to be honest, to be fair, we've been given, right? This is a gift. This is a wonderful gift, this time off. The world is slowing down for once. For once, the harbor of Atlantis has had to cease its operations, and the air is clearer, the water is fresher. I live in London, it's quiet, it's never been that calm. And this calm in itself perhaps is already a redirection of our senses, right? Rather than, look, speak of academia. Academic principle, which isn't a principle, but the academic modus operandi now is publish or perish. So before you have anything to say, you have to publish or you perish. That's very violent, right? And hence perhaps also the cynicism that comes about with many academics when they get older. And now many of them who've played the game have been fired. Within a week, they were fired because the universities sense this lack and they can't get enough international students to pay £16,000 a year. It's a pretty good mirror, yeah. So someone just said, fuck, that's one good mirror. But so rather than now focusing on what we could lack, right, on the other side, the income that we will lack, etc., we must work, I think, or project towards the possibility of being in a relationship with being that was entirely closed off from us. That's something that I think could occur with this course. Well, I'm not Plato, so I can't tell you why he did not finish the Critias. This is one of the weird things about questions sometimes, and people ask you to speak for a thinker. That's impossible, right? We would have to ask Plato why he didn't finish the Critias if he didn't finish it. But I think what's more important is what the Critias that we have, what it tells us, which is that once we direct our sense to Skole, then Athens becomes Athens. Only then, and then that's when it's in touch with being. Right? And what is being? Toti en enai, as Aristotle says, which means that which was being, that which is old, that which has been, which as such is coming towards us and is our genuine future. So thank you all very much. And please, if you like, sign up for that course. Use the coupon code so you get 50% off. And I hope to see as many of you there as possible. Seminars will start on the 18th of April. They will run for 7 consecutive Saturdays. And if you have any questions on the course, just email me. The email you'll find on the YouTube channel, and you can or message me on Twitter or something like that. And so, yeah, thanks all very, very much for listening and watching. And yeah, please, I would be really, really happy to see many of you there. I've seen a couple of people have already signed up, and that's great. So thank you very much to those who have. And yeah, because I'll say it again to be a bit bold in this period. Let's build a new Athens. And well, thank you, Socrates. I mean, look, sign up for the course. There'll be more of this. And so, yeah, sorry, but Henry, this is not about death. Okay, death-phobic society. I have not heard about this. But I will give a course on Heidegger on death and being. And there is something that we are in a death-phobic society, but this is not the time to talk about this. A new Athens, where we direct our sense towards Skole, be properly classical, full-flowing yes-saying, and full-flowing longing to being, rather than focusing on lack and how we can get more and more and more and more and more, which only feeds the cybernetic will to will that can never, ever be satisfied. And so, yes, thanks all very much. The links down below. Sign up now. There should be enough coupons for the 20 people who are listening to get 20% off for some proper otium cum dignitate. This is what teaching should be. It should be otium cum. So what is a university? Now I'm getting started. University is the place of otium cum dignitate. That's what it should be. Not a place of frail nerves and getting credit points and making customers happy. No. If a university is not a space for otium cum dignitate, leisure, idleness with dignity, then it's not a university. And it's pointless to speak of academia where there is no academy, where there are no longer, at the center of university, there's supposed to be the philosophy department. That's what they're supposed to be. If not, it's pointless. And everything else is a polytechnics, right? I'm sorry, but that's what it is. And so what these group seminars are, and this is what they're like with my private students too, is a space for otium cum dignitate, where we are suspended from pressures and find again a sense. Yes, university has gone wrong. It has gone wrong, but there's no point in being resentful. Right? If there's one thing you can learn from Nietzsche, is don't be resentful. There's no point. There's no point. To cultivate this stance of idleness with dignity is actually to suspend one's resentment. There's no point. Don't be resentful. Don't complain. There's rather build, as Heidegger says, build and dwell and think towards a new world, another world. And there will be some kind of evaluation, which will be in the course itself. There will be continuous feedback from me, and then of course also from the group and from the group discussions. So there will be everyone will get to share their thoughts as far as they want to, right? And then I will respond to those questions, and over time this will basically self-develop, and some will take on the lead, etc. But it'll always come back to the course content, and it'll always come back to what I'm trying to get across, and very much, very, very based in the original sources. So I will be sitting there with Plato in my hand, with the original Greek on the left and the German on the right, and we'll be making sure that this is not going off into no man's land. And so you won't have to write essays. However, something that has happened in previous sessions is, if people feel so inclined to write a longer email, which basically is an essay, you're totally free to send that to me, and I will come back to you with feedback. So that's okay. Yeah, thanks, Privada. So yeah, that's basically this kind of, then you would have sort of an essay feedback as well. So I've done this in the past, for example, with the Heidegger Deleuze course, when people had longer essay questions or so, or some sort of an essay, I responded and gave them my 2 cents and my view of things. So there is some sort of feedback, but there isn't a formalized way of giving you some kind of credit points or having passed with a, but to be fair, if you look at the British system, if you get a 65, what do you know? Nothing. I mean, you get a 65, what does that mean? That means you're in the mean. It means pass, right? But there will be feedback throughout the course, because seven seminars give us enough time to really develop a feel for the group and a good group discussion, which will then always come back to the original source of the text. And as I said before, if someone wants to write an essay, I'm very happy to give feedback to that. And by the way, also very happy also to do student presentations. So after a couple of weeks, we can have student presentations, which means that you present something for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I give you feedback and the others give you feedback. And something else that Justin Murphy and I will do very likely in the next couple of weeks or so, and something that I will also do with this course, is that those of you who want to can give a student presentation in a live stream. So all you would have to do is log into your YouTube account and stream live on my channel. So that's something that we can do after this is over. So you can present your thoughts on leisure, right? If you want full-on automation, present it, argue it well, and face the critique and the praise for it afterwards. So that's something I will be doing with Justin, with the Heidegger Deleuze cohort, with the first one that we had. That we'll offer that course again sometime towards the end of this year. But this is something that's also possible for this. So there will be plenty of, to use cybernetic language, feedback. No, but there will be plenty of, to use non-cybernetic language, there will be plenty of room for discussing your thoughts and getting a response from a group that is friendly and totally non-instrumental. That's very important to me, is that this is a space for otium cum dignitate, in this sense, where we lie there with a glass of wine, as the Greeks did in their symposia. In their symposium, which means to drink together, and where we will, argue, but also then learn together. And that's the feedback that you will get. So thank you. Yeah, so by the way, so someone's just saying, I'm no academic, but I'd be keen to read that. Here's something. Okay, yeah. So this is exactly what happens in these groups, right? So people start talking, and that'll be happening in the group even more, because you get to know each other, you get to see everybody's face. And by the way, you don't need to be an academic or have studied to do this. And so, yeah, I look forward to seeing you there. If you have any more questions, just email me. The email should be all over the place on my other, it might be in that video too. Or you can leave a comment or so with your email. I can get back to you there. You can message me on Twitter, or I'm on Instagram, all these other things that people now have. And yeah, so people have signed up already, which is great. Thanks very much for that. And see you all, most of you, April 18th at 6 p.m. GMT. So I'm signing off. Enjoy your evening in wherever you are, or your afternoon now. And thank you very much indeed for listening. Please stay well. All the best to you and yours. Chin chin.